everybody. Hope you've had a lovely lunch and a catch-up with, hopefully, friends and colleagues that you perhaps haven't met for a while, and some new colleagues. My name's Mark Driscoll, founder and director of Tasting the Future, and I have the pleasure of moderating this session on power and politics this afternoon. Bearing in mind you've just had lunch and your blood is probably sinking from your brains to your stomachs, I do want to make this as interactive as possible. We'll be using a tool called Slido, so we're going to pose you some questions during this session. We've got some interventions from our esteemed panel who are coming with different perspectives on the issue of power and politics. They've got 5 minutes each, and then I would like a significant part of this session to be a Q&A, hearing from you on your own experiences, challenges around the issue of power and politics, which came up quite frequently amongst the presenters in this morning's session. So who controls the food we produce and eat, and issues of power politics really, I think, goes to the heart of some of the sustainability, health and equity challenges we confront today. And I think personally it either determines whether we have a food system that regenerates human, animal, planetary health, or one which continues to prioritize profit based on business as usual, leading us to the ultimate part of extinction. Issues of power and politics are really tough nuts to crack, but without addressing these systemic challenges, we will fail to tackle the climate and biodiversity crisis, plus the human and animal health crisis. There is obviously a concentration of power over what farmers grow and how they grow it, how food is processed, packaged, transported, how much it costs, and what actually ends up ultimately on our plates. I often speak to farmers. They do often feel disempowered, disenfranchised. They no longer own the technologies they often use, are forced often in many countries to use fertilizers and seeds controlled by the big multinational corporates, and sometimes and often don't have any control over their own markets. As citizens, we all need to be active engagers within our food system rather than inactive consumers of food. Yet many of us feel powerless as citizens and have very few meaningful choices in the types of food that we eat. Our everyday choices, as again we heard this morning, are shaped by the overwhelming market power, for example, of the supermarket. In the UK, 4 supermarkets control 75–80% of the food we eat and often determine the price a farmer receives for his or her produce. Our research and academic organisations receive millions of pounds on technological solutions, propping up a broken productivist growth food system agenda. And again, very little funding goes towards agroecological solutions, indigenous peoples solutions that actually involve farmers, citizens, indigenous peoples, and disenfranchised groups, those with lived experiences that most impacted by the food policies created and yet have little power or control. Food systems are often shaped by politics rather than policies. Myself have spent many years working at a European, UK national level, working on things like CAP, and often policymakers, in my experience, do get it, but actually policies come down to politics. It's politics that trumps policies often. So to unpack some of these issues and more, I have an esteemed panel of guests whom I'm going to turn to shortly. But before I do that, hopefully on the screen behind me, a question is going to come up to the audience within this room and online. It's using something called Slido. There we go, it's online. So please, if you're online, if you're using a computer, you can use the QR code to log on to the right site. Otherwise, just type in slido.com into your phones or your devices, and then enter the code 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And hopefully, I'll give you just a brief minute or so to do that. Hopefully, a question will pop up. And the question is, using your own experience, which group of actors do you think holds most power and influence across the food system? It's online there. Please choose the top 3 that you think have the most power and influence. Obviously, oftentimes, there is no just one group of actors that have total control and influence. So I'll give you a little minute or two just to do that, and you can see live what is coming up here. So I'll give you another few seconds. 56% of you think food retailers, suppliers of fertilizer, pesticide, seed, investors is coming up quite high, governments, traders, interestingly a bit lower, and probably not surprising, citizens is coming bottom of that list. So it just gives us an idea in the room where you think most power and influence lie. And I probably think that is no surprise to many of you and echoes some of the conversations this morning. I'm going to come back to you at the end of the panel discussion with another question. So no sleeping post-lunch. And please do think about some questions. I'm going to take live questions from in the room and online to open up a little bit of a discussion throughout this session. I'm now going to turn to the panelists. I suppose, Olivia, my first question to you, really. I know IPES Food has done a lot of work around power and politics, particularly linked to the protein discussion. How do you think we need to address power within the livestock and meat consumption debate?
Thank you, Mark, for your introductory remarks and for launching this Slido-led exchange with the audience. You said politics all too often trump policies. And I think it's true that one of the major obstacles we face in food systems reform is the important weight in decision-making of the incumbents who gain from the status quo and who are today the champions of the food economy that we've developed in the livestock, industrial livestock sector as in other sectors. They have de facto acquired a position in decision-making that allows them to veto any transformative change. Why is this? It's not simply because they resort to corruption of politicians or because they finance lobbyists working on their behalf in capitals. It is, I think, more importantly, because they are the champions of economies of scale, of large-scale production that global markets and buyers, commodity buyers demand. They have research and development departments that allow them to develop new breeds, new plant varieties, and to therefore control the logic of technological advances, and because they control the complex logistical chains in global supply chains. So all this allows these companies to say to politicians, trust us, we know how to produce food for mass consumption to be satisfied and for the demand of consumer society to be met. And if you impede us, if you impose on us too strong regulations, the price will be not only employment losses, but also higher prices for the food that your voters will have to buy. And that is really what allows them this privileged access to politicians and makes it difficult to effectively regulate them. So we have entered into what is sometimes called, particularly by an economist called Luigi Zingales, the vicious cycle of the Medicis. And the vicious cycle of the Medici is a system in which the dominant economic actors use that economic influence they have to translate this into political influence, and in turn use that political influence to reinforce their economically dominant position. So, for example, they manage to obtain from legislators very high protection for intellectual property rights, for the new breeds that they develop, the new plants that they develop, and the new technologies that they promote. They managed to capture most of the subsidies that go to the largest producers, and basically are one reason why concentration is increasing, particularly with respect to access to land, and they can very easily challenge the environmental regulations or regulations seeking to protect animal welfare that politicians would like to impose on them. And this is what UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, calls the state of the rentiers, right? So the state is being captured by those economic actors so that the state ends up being working for them and for their interests to be reinforced. This is why food democracy is so needed. This is why one source of hope is that in a growing number of cities and regions, we establish food policy councils that democratize the food system, increase transparency and accountability in how decisions are made. And I very much hope that this evolution can continue, and that ultimately we will regain control over food systems.
Great. And I think there are quite a few signs in parts of Europe of citizen councils happening. Vandana, perhaps I just want to turn to you really as a kind of active campaigner in food democracy. How can we shift power back to the farmer and citizen? We saw in the audience answers to the question that citizens came at the bottom. How can we shift power from the middle back towards the edges of the food value chain?
First, by realizing that power is never given by somebody. You live the power. You have to be the change you want to see, as Gandhi said. And wherever, in spite of the concentration and distortions of the global food system, everywhere, locally, alternatives are emerging. And I think every time we talk about the big damage, we should talk about the large, dispersed, decentralized regeneration, organic initiatives, and local food economies. I think the second thing that we definitely need to do, for which we need to join as citizens and farmers. I noticed at the end of it, the farmer disappeared, poor guy. You know? And citizens have power. But citizens have no power if the food you're eating is rubbish that's making you sick. You know? If you're 75% of your chronic diseases are coming from ultra-processed food, your cancers are coming from pesticides. Andre's done a very good book on the myth of pesticides and the links between all the diseases. And of course, then, the fact that what you're eating on these large-scale farms is, A, the leftovers of the animal food and biofuel industry, but more importantly than that, it is nutritionally empty commodities. It is not food. I don't think we should honor it with the word food. I call it anti-food because it does the opposite of food food should do. Food should nourish you. Food should give you health. And food that gives you sickness and disease is anti-food. So we have an anti-food system, but we have the knowledge, reality, practice over thousands of years. Australia, 60,000 years. This morning, the First Nations, 23,000 years. We are talking about good experience that has been buried because of the false narrative. I think the second is that false narrative is based on totally false calculus of efficiency, of productivity, and a bad science. When I wrote my book, The Green Revolution, I couldn't believe it. The soil is an empty container. It's not a living soil. The plant is a machine, and the fuel on which it runs is fertilizer. Plants are sentient beings. Plants are intelligent beings. Plants have symbiosis with the mycorrhizae. So the false science, I think we are in a moment where the real science is growing by bounds, and we have to turn it into the people's knowledge and the knowledge that is received by policymakers. We have to point out the fact that this system's false productivity is based on energy slaves, substituting farmers with fossil fuels and chemicals based on fossil fuels. That if those costs were truly taken into account, we just couldn't afford this system. But I think the most important issue is both citizens and farmers need to join hands for a food system that is based on sustaining the health of the planet and giving health to communities. That we have to start seeing farmers not as producers of commodities. We have to start seeing farmers as our physicians who are giving us health. And we have to take care of them. And if we've done about 3 reports on this, that you say, oh, too much money to the farmer. And then you're willing to spend trillions of dollars on sicknesses. If we treat the food-related diseases as part of the cost of food, we will immediately realize that local, biodiverse, regenerative, organic is the most affordable option for the planet and people. And I really feel we all need to join hands for this dystopia that's being imposed on us. A farming without farmers, more drones to spray pesticides, bigger farms with more machines, more monocultures to produce raw material of amino acids and protein to make food in factories and labs. It'll still stay large destructive farms, but now it'll not be food, it'll be raw material. It'll not be animal feed, but it'll be feed for these factories, which will run the same logic of energy intensive, bio-waste, pollution, everything else. And then food without farms. But food is the link between us and the earth. Food is the currency of life. Food is what connects us to the soil, to the plants, to the animals, to the insects. And a disruption in the food system is at the root of all the diseases we face today, including the ecological crises and biodiversity extinction. So realizing that, food is vital to our very being, treating food with respect and the growers of food with respect, and giving respect to our choices as the highest level of democracy. We have a beautiful ancient text called the Taittiriya Upanishad, which says the highest dharma is growing and giving good food. Highest adharma, highest bad act, is to grow food badly and to let people around you, and serve bad food and let people around you starve. So we know what true food democracy and food sovereignty looks like. And we know that local, biodiverse, regenerative, organic works at every level. And this myth that organic doesn't feed the world, yeah, is the only way to feed the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Vandana. That's very, very powerful. I heard lots about narratives, kind of reconnecting the power of linking food with the soil. I just want to now introduce somebody that you won't have met. I want to introduce Andre Law, who's International Director at Regeneration International. Perhaps I could just turn to you. Given your experience around regenerative agriculture, are there any kind of power political barriers or opportunities to mainstreaming kind of regenerative and agroecological farming systems based on your experience?
Okay, look, thanks for the question. And what I'd like to start from is from the perspective of a farmer. I've had a lifetime in farming, and I've also been privileged to meet with farmers on every continent on this planet, except for Antarctica. But that may be in the future with the way things are going. But essentially, farmers tend to be very conservative people because they cannot afford crop failure. Crop failure in the global south could mean going without food. But for most farmers, actually most farmers are in debt in the south and the north. And crop failure means that the bank or the money lender owns you. And so people are very frightened to change. They want to keep with what they knew worked last year and the year before. And change management in farming is a very difficult process. So what we have to do is make change risk-free, make change easy. And also, when I talk about making change easy, making the concepts of change very easy to understand. And for us, when we formed Regeneration International, and Vandana was one of the original people on that steering committee, we realised that the word regenerative was non-threatening, very positive, and something that farmers could get. And it has taken off really well because most farmers actually want to change. They're in debt. They're not doing well. Farmers tend to be the lowest socio-economic group on every continent. The idea of the rich farmer is not really true. Rich corporations, yes, but actual family farmers tend to be the lowest socioeconomic group. They know things aren't right. They know that they want to do it better, but they need the help and the confidence to do it. And that's where, forming organisations, grower organisations, peak body groups, and forming communities that help change is really important. And farmers don't take too kindly to government. Look what's happening in the Netherlands and France at the moment with government interventions, because governments are badly out of touch with farmers, and farmers, rightfully so, are very, very suspicious of governments. But farmers learn from farmers. Farmers trust farmers. Farmers look over fences to see what other farmers are doing. So the key here is always working with early adopters, people who want to change, and to ensure that they have success, their neighbours will look at that. The other key to change are markets, because most farmers are actually very good at growing. And this whole idea is, we've got to, sustainable intensification, we've got to produce more from less, is rubbish. As you've heard today, we've produced around 3 times the amount of food we need. The problem is distribution. That's markets. The other problem why farmers are the lowest socio-economic group, in the 1920s, farmers on average got 85% of the market value of their crops. Now they get less than 0.03. The rest of it goes to the middleman or the middle market, and it's an unfair system. So we need to change that and get the money from the sale from consumers to farmers and bypass the market. That is a really important issue, and get that money back into farmers and farming communities. And the thing is that these systems are in place. These systems are happening. And, you know, for me, being back here in Europe, is the EU doing a project of having 25% organic by 2030. I think that is really important. And that has come about because as farmers and like-minded people, consumers, we organised and we influenced government. Take a long time, but we can see wins like that. And I think this is the really important thing of this event, is having like-minded people together. We work together. We are the majority. We win.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. And at the end of this conversation, I'll be interested in your own experience as farmers, particularly in terms of opportunities to connect farmer with citizen to, you know, new business models is what we really want, and ideas to make that happen. Perhaps I turn to my next guest. So I want to introduce you to Susan, who's the Director of Vital Landscapes Africa, working with the World Resources Institute. I gather that's what WRI stands for on my sheet. And Susan, obviously you manage quite a lot of work with a large team in Africa. What kind of power, you know, political constraints do you confront in your everyday work?
So I normally say Africa is the battleground for any kind of technologies, any kind of ideas. Everybody wants to save Africa. But we've seen those efforts years and years over. They've failed spectacularly. And they fail because of misreading the African continent, misreading what the smallholder farmers in Africa stand for and what they are interested in. Particularly if you look at the Green Revolution model and other institutions that have really tried to push for that model, pushing for a few crop varieties, pushing for it in terms of research, in terms of funding, in terms of breeding, in terms of getting farmers to adopt, and the evidence shows very little adoption, disadoption, and even completely farmers ignoring that and going back to what they know works best for them. And so the reductionist model that has been promoted on that continent has failed, but we see over and over again it being promoted and being pushed. And these are some of the dynamics that we have to deal with on our daily lives, because on one hand, you're dealing with the farmers, and you see farmers want to diversify. They know, for instance, the diversity of indigenous crops, indigenous vegetables, root tubers that are resilient to climate change, that are adapted to the local ecologies. And we have completely become blind in those ones in terms of prioritizing them, in terms of funding, in terms of supporting genetic farmers to store, to share seeds. On the other hand, we are completely making policies and laws that are against the diversity that the farmers want to work on. The second power dynamic that we normally see, and it's very related to the recent report that IPES panel that I'm part of has just released around the politics of proteins. If anybody in this room has not read that report, read it, because even though it looks at the politics of proteins from a livestock perspective, it talks a lot about, for instance, the blindness of Eurocentric views of what people should be consuming that are then being pushed on African farmers. And let me even narrow down beyond farmers and talk about pastoralists, for instance. That report, what it says is there's actually not a protein gap. So all this fascination around proteins is misinformed. What we see is the majority of people who do not have sufficient protein actually do not have sufficient of all the other nutrients. They are the people who are suffering from hunger and malnutrition. And so you cannot solve that by just focusing on proteins. You need to focus on dietary diversity, and we need to work with farmers to produce food that is actually nutrient dense and that is healthy and that is good for human consumption. And so what I'm implying here is the dynamics, and I'll give you that with an example. I was in a workshop some time back, 2 weeks ago, and in this workshop, apparently the funder decided that the funding cannot be able to, it cannot fund any buying or eating of meat in workshops. And let me tell you, a lot of people who had come for that workshop, a lot of farmer representatives, groups of women, most of those people actually have meat rarely in their lives. And so when they come for this workshop, when they were told you cannot eat meat because eating of meat is causing planetary boundaries, it's causing greenhouse gas emissions, they were like, our meat consumption, how much meat do we eat? You know? And so there are all sorts of confusion around, and also, of course, most of the pastoralist communities, the livestock is embedded within their culture. It's not just about meat. This is their source of nutrients for women, for children. That's all they've eaten for thousands and thousands of years. And if you look at greenhouse gas emissions from those communities, those are not the guys who are causing climate change. And so when we have these kind of blanket recommendations of shifting diets, including putting conditionalities that your funds cannot be able to buy meat even if it's in a place where people don't actually get that meat, it's very misinformed. So I just want to highlight the last aspect of politics that we deal with, and especially in the food systems. The disconnect between agriculture, biodiversity, and especially contextualizing it. So we see a lot of agriculture. What we are pushing for is around increasing productivity, which I've said it's a false narrative. You need to look at the whole food systems. But even more so is our lack of understanding of how it connects with biodiversity. And for African context, not even on the mitigation side, by adaptation. Because we've seen crop failures, we've seen droughts, and we've seen that we need to be able to connect food systems to make them resilient to climate change. And so in summary, how we deal with those, we work a lot on policy, we work a lot on evidence generation, because you cannot counter these things with perspectives, otherwise everybody comes with their own perspective in the room. And above all, we work with farmers to catalyze and to show that diversified production systems are actually possible, and it is possible to even scale them.
Thank you. And I think you raised some really important points around agro biodiversity. I think we have 70,000 edible crop species, and yet we know the stats around 6 to 8 provide 60 or 70% of the global calories. There's a lot of what are called orphan or forgotten crops that can adapt to things like climate change. So it's a really, really important point. I now want to introduce my next panelists, Helen, who's Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House. I suppose my question to you, Helen, is around the kind of policy required to address the kind of climate, biodiversity, and health challenges, and how we really unlock the policy, political roadblocks. We talked about, it's politics over policy. How do we square that one?
Yeah, so in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Right, hi, everybody. Thanks for that, Mark. I'm going to take that in 2 parts, actually, Mark, and starting with largely drawing from, actually, a paper that we published towards the end of last year, which was actually titled Aligning Food Systems with Climate and Biodiversity Targets, so very convenient. Just to point out the obvious, of course, policy must change fundamentally to prioritise longer-term goals related to planetary health, rather than short-term goals aligned with business as usual, which is what we currently see. So in terms of climate change and biodiversity loss, even plans to 2030 lack detail and suitable levels of ambition. Policies that enable a food system transformation are absolutely critical for addressing both of those issues. Food systems contribute around 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, and agricultural land use change is the leading cause of biodiversity loss. Anything less than a food system transformation is at odds with meeting climate change and biodiversity goals, including those that we've heard the most about, targeting land protection, for example, the 30 by 30 target, and particularly those focused on biodiversity net gains and limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So while improvements are absolutely essential across the entire food system, the immediate focus really must be on reducing the burden of animal agriculture, as this offers the most substantial potential contributions to both climate change mitigation and biodiversity goals. So decreasing impacts on the farm, which is essentially the current policy focus, are not enough, and a reduction in the production and consumption is also needed. And I think it's really important to sort of break down on what we mean by food system transformation, because that's quite a big, lofty term which could be interpreted in a few different ways, I guess. So for policy, the overarching requirement is to ensure that domestic biodiversity and climate policies over the next decade align with the global biodiversity framework and limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And this really means pursuing only food policies that are consistent with those domestic climate change mitigation and biodiversity targets, and don't preclude the attainment of those targets at the global level. There are a few important actions within that policy realignment too. So first of all, moving away from a focus on conserving existing land use to a strategic approach based on protecting areas with high biodiversity value and potential to store carbon, and that's needed at home and abroad. So second, in addition to protecting important areas, we really need to restore carbon and biodiversity-rich areas. There's substantial potential to do this in high and upper middle income countries, but this is only really possible with large-scale reductions in agricultural land use enabled by shifting away from animal agriculture. So third, changes to production and consumption that are commensurate with domestic climate and biodiversity goals is absolutely essential. And this shift should also protect globally important carbon and biodiversity repositories by reducing the demand for agricultural land abroad. So linking the climate and biodiversity agendas through an integrated land assessment would actually allow countries to identify how climate, biodiversity and food policies interact, and crucially, which policy pathways deliver the most benefit, resolve inconsistencies, and tackle the biggest threats over the current decade. So more broadly, a commitment to peaking livestock production, deforestation, and fossil fuels in the near term would be great signals of intent from policymakers, but we should absolutely be considering within that how to treat fishing and aquaculture within those commitments. Fishing has significant biodiversity impacts, as we've been hearing about, and growth in consumption is expected to come from aquaculture. So we certainly shouldn't be just purely land-focused in that. There are obviously differences within these sort of broad policy reorientations in terms of how high-income, middle-income and low-income countries need to act. For example, the onus on reducing livestock consumption is certainly on high-consuming nations. I think, being prescriptive at the high level about how policy needs to change, that's the relatively easy part of your question. And how we actually unlock that, I think, is incredibly difficult for two main reasons. So first, the opacity in terms of, for example, how big agricultural companies actually operate, how governments actually form policy, that really limits our understanding of what's really going on in those processes and which pathways to change might be most effective. Secondly, which might be even more disappointing, I think, is that there's not one single lever that could actually do that unlocking. And I think it really comes back to needing that fundamental political change that you've been talking about to actually change the full system in unison. So I'm out of time, so I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think your colleague Tim Benton this morning talked about some of those power relationships between citizen, farmer,
Yeah.
politics, consumer, and some of the ways that could potentially be unlocked. Lastly, but not least, I want to turn to Philip. I suppose I have worked with civil society organisations over the last 15 or 20 years. I suppose my question to you is, what are the opportunities to collaborate between civil society organisations, farmers, citizens to unlock some of these power and politic dynamics, and how can we address some of those challenges? Philip.
Thank you, Mark, very much for your question. And really, your question gets to the heart of why we are hosting with our partners, IPES Food and others, this conference today and tomorrow, to bring people together, to be focused on solutions, on the things that we can do together, to find common platforms, and essentially to focus on what unites us rather than what divides us, about moving beyond tribalism and factionism, which only serves to benefit the industrial agriculturalists, the status quo. So I think there are increasing numbers of opportunities to work together. The other facet that I'm sure you will have recognized, the other facet here is joining the dots, the interconnectivity of the issues. So Compassion in World Farming, an animal welfare organisation, why are we talking about some of the issues, biodiversity, for example, that we've been talking about here today? Because the way that we rear animals, the way that we treat them in a welfare sense, whether we're cruel or kind, has a big bearing on the biodiversity of the planet, on the nutrient density. I was particularly taken, Susan, by your very insightful points about dietary diversity and nutrient density. When you treat animals badly, chicken, for example, you go back to 1970 when my mother started to buy chicken as a treat once a week. Those chickens compared today, well, the chicken today, highly intensively produced, very large stocking densities, growing so fast they go from tiny chicks to slaughter age, grotesque giants in just 6 weeks. Well, compared to 1970 and my mother's chicken, those now have up to 3 times the saturated fat and a third of the protein. So really, really big differences. So the interconnectivity is there. So joining forces in collaborative ventures and focusing on what unites us rather than divides us, I think is really important. And uniting around the big themes, and that's the reason why we called this conference Extinction or Regeneration, is because time really is running out. We talked about 60 harvests left to save humanity, essentially, this morning. What does that translate to? Well, that's 60 years. And actually, the calculations, because it is a calculation, not a prediction, the calculation on which that is based, that the soil will run out in 60 years' time, was done 13 years ago. We're running out. Calamity strikes for humanity way before we actually get to no soil. So focusing on the big things, moving to a regenerative future, and Andre, your point about taking that word as a positive is really important. Building the biggest, most diverse movement is so important, and including farmers, because who benefits from factory farming? It's not farmers. It's not farmers to blame. It's policymakers a lifetime ago, and the companies that have grown up to benefit, the companies that sell the farmers, the pharmaceutical inputs, the antibiotics and the chemical fertilizers and the pesticides and the cages and the grain and so on. They're the ones that benefit. They're the ones that are undermining our future. So let's come together, farmers, the people, communities in the global south, in the global north, across the planet, and focus on the big themes, moving to regenerative, also focusing on more diverse diets, less dependent on livestock products. And that means looking at where we need to make the big wins. Compassion in World Farming has today launched a new report that, based on scientific dietary evidence, looks at who needs to do the most in reducing meat and dairy consumption. And it is, of course, the high-consuming countries. And by that, we mean countries in the global north. We mean UK and EU needing to reduce by 70%, with the US and other high-consuming countries in the Americas reducing by 80%. And we've got to do this quickly if we're to save the future for our planet. So coming together, common platforms, inclusivity, moving beyond things that divide us, meeting on the points that unite us. And this way, we can save the future for our children, for animals, people, and the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Some really pertinent, important points on collaboration. Of course, it's collaboration is always much more tricky to do in practice, and takes, from my own experience, it takes quite a lot of time, effort, resources, particularly when you're having organisations with different kind of value bases and different visions. But there's a whole, that's a whole nother debate, I think. We've got about 30 minutes now. I can already see hands going up. So I do want to have quite a session, interactive session with you, the audience. I'm going to start in the room, and then I want to go online. I've had quite a few questions online. If you're online, please do send your questions through on Slido. We might not get to everybody. Please just state your name and yeah, kind of your question or a point in relation to some of your experiences around addressing issues of politics and power. My only request is you keep it fairly, short and sweet, so we can get through as many questions or points as possible. We have roving microphones. I saw this gentleman, probably because this is straight in front of me, put his hand up first, but I can take questions from around the room, either to the panel or a short point.
Great, thank you. What a great conference. And obviously there is too much to think about to articulate this as shortly as I'd like. But I would support everything you've talked about in terms of regenerative agriculture and indigenous agriculture, restoring the land. Particularly, I was touched by that kinship with the land from the last presentation this morning. So fantastic conference. Agribusiness loves growth. Agribusiness concentrates power. We've heard all that. Agribusiness doesn't really care where the growth comes from as long as it gets a slice of it. So it is interested in new products such as Petri dish grown meat, and to shift away from meat. It doesn't care, it'll go where the money, it'll follow the money, and so will the investors. It loves growth, it particularly loves growth of consumers, and it loves growth of people. For me, the question which hasn't really been answered is, yes, we need redistribution of food, but have we got time? I've worked in the organic movement, I've worked in wildlife for about 30 years. There's been some growth, but nothing like as much. I haven't seen a decline in agribusiness. It's only grown and concentrated. So we're not succeeding unless we also address some other inequities, and particularly, and I wear the T-shirt, empower women to save the planet. Hundreds of millions of women do not have any choice over how many children they have, when they have them, or whether they have them at all. Hundreds of millions of girls are not in school. All of those numbers have increased because of population growth. We hit 8 billion last year. We are set at the UN's median projection to hit 10.4 billion. That's an extra 2.4 billion by 2080. That's their median projection. The high projection is 15 billion. The low projection is 7.3. You could hit 7.3 if you empowered women and girls. I don't quite see why we're not addressing the factor of population as well as consumption.
Okay. Does anyone want to respond to that in the panel? Yes, Olivia.
I would like to thank you very much for making this point, which I think is indeed extremely important. To a certain extent, there's been a taboo in the UN discussing this issue. I think for two reasons. First, because population growth being the result not only of high fertility rates, a large number of children per woman, but also increased life expectancy and reduced child mortality. Population growth has been seen as a great victory for modern public health, right? And for many countries, they actually send, they see a success story in the fact that their population has been growing. So that's the first reason why it is a topic that has been insufficiently, I think, discussed. And the second reason is that some authoritarian solutions, such as the one-child policy in China or the experience of India that Vandana Shiva would describe much better than I under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, have been very traumatizing. But you don't say we should return to those policies. You say we should empower women so that they receive more education, they have a smaller number of children, they choose whether or not to have children. And I do think it's indeed extremely important. In addition to that, education and empowerment of women, I think population growth can be also stemmed by improving social protection. One major reason why parents still seek to have large families, a large number of children, is because they fear for their old age. And they do not know what the future will bear for them. If they had some income security after they retire, stop working, this would go a long way towards encouraging them to have smaller families. So this is why, in my view, social protection should be, together with empowerment and education of women, a key priority within the UN.
Great. I think, Philip, you wanted to, and then Susan, you want to come in?
Robin, thank you so much for your question. It's so important that these issues are addressed in the round, and thank you for raising the need to empower women and girls. The issue of population often doesn't get a profile, doesn't get recognised. It's worth also us remembering that for every 1 billion extra people on the planet, as it stands, they come with 10 billion extra farmed animals every year. That is a huge weight on the planet. So we really are talking about planetary boundaries, and these issues have to be addressed in the round in an inclusive, diverse, and compassionate way, by empowering the people who can make the change. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you. Susan.
Again, thank you so much, Robin, for the question. But am I the only one who's wondering why population issue is reduced to women? Do women reproduce on their own? I think we need to be more imaginative in terms of the solutions that we offer, because I've not seen any woman who gets children primarily on their own, even if they decide to have one. So a more integrative societal approach, I think there's also a lot in terms that men can do, in terms of understanding what their actions also result in terms of population growth, and interventions that they can take as well, choices that they can make as well, because we are all affected by the challenge when it becomes a societal challenge. But otherwise, a fantastic point. I just want to say there's also the role that men should play in that.
A gentleman in the front here.
Hello, thank you very much, and a good point there. I'm Christopher Stopes from Organic Farmers and Growers, and I'm particularly interested to explore with the panel the extent to which the term regenerative seems to be largely captured by agribusiness in the interests of intensification and the use of their inputs. And I'm interested specifically then, Philip, for CIWF to promote regenerative farming seems to me to be rather missing the point. Now, as an organic advocate for many decades, I've always felt that organic is essentially regenerative, and regenerative should be organic. There may be reasons why organic is not as prevalent as it could be, and those are reasons to do with the lack of cost internalisation by conventional food, but more particularly it's by the extent to which agribusiness has captured food production. And I want to ask the panel how much they believe that they also have been captured by agribusiness in their promotion of the word regenerative, and to request them to more clearly think about the way an organic system, which is a standard which includes what you must not do and what you must do, that together with animal welfare, it's the best system for animal welfare, bears down on intensification, reduces climate change, gas emissions, and increases biodiversity. Such a good idea seems one that would be better if it were more widely promoted, rather than sticking with this bland corporatist term of regenerative. I'd love comments from the panel on that.
Thank you. It's a fantastic question, and it's a live debate, I think, at the moment. And to many people, there's quite a difference between regenerative agriculture and agroecological forms of agriculture. Yeah. But I'll be in Vandana. Over to you.
Yeah. Organic is a scientific, economic, established system of a century old. It's as old exactly what got born along with chemicals, with Albert Howard, Eve Balfour, and the rest. And that's why industry had a very organized attack on organic, which is why people were silenced. We live in censorship days. All it needs is 2 or 3 heavy messaging to say, don't talk this, don't use this language. And our work is to show, like Howard talks about it, that organic farming, he doesn't use the term, it was given later, that farming in nature's ways is what farmers of India were doing, from whom he learned and he made them their professors, that farming in nature's ways are based on nature's laws. Because of the attacks, and I think Andre mentioned this, at that time, we came up with the word regenerative. It's not a corporate invention. Please don't get mistaken. It's a movement language to continue to talk organic, now as regenerative organic, showing that regeneration is working with the living earth and her regenerative powers of a living soil, living biodiversity, our living ecosystems. And organic is working with the earth with the principles of biodiversity and the law of the earth. The two are the same, just different names. What I love about my civilization is we realized you fight over words, you'll keep fighting for the rest of your life. What you should do is, for the same thing, realize it has many facets. So we give Ganga 1,000 names. We give the mountain 1,000 names. we give the divine feminine 1,000 names, Lalita Sahasranam. So I don't think we should hand over. I'm just doing a piece for an anthology that regenerative is another name for organic. We cannot hand it over to the corporations, because I've read every paper they've published, from the Syngentas to all the others. They're talking about more of the same. They use our language about what it is, and then what they're doing is about hyper-industrialism. More chemicals, now of course, managed with digital messaging. So I don't think if we hand over regenerative, we are strengthening our movement. We are weakening our movement. We're handing over what is ours.
Yeah.
So we've got to reclaim regenerative, show that it's the same as organic, the same as agroecology, and depending on the circles and the spheres, use the words that are popular in that sphere. But don't give up regenerative, define it more deeply.
Yeah. Fantastic.
And I'd just like to follow on from that. As someone who's on every continent regularly and meeting with farmers, this is a global farmers' revolution. It has not been hijacked by Syngenta or Bayer. I know that because I'm on the front line. They're trying to. We always knew this day would come, right from the beginning, because we saw the way they, we've got industrial organic in the US, and that's divided the whole organic movement, despite the fact there's standards and certification. We've seen a similar thing here in Europe with agroecology, and agroecology put out by the French government, for instance, which is business as usual with a light wash of green. They're experts at hijacking, and we knew as soon as we became successful, they would want to hijack us. That's a sign of success. That's a sign that we're a threat. Now, very importantly, the opposite of regenerative is degenerative. And by definition, any agricultural system, or any system that degenerates, is not regenerative. And that's something that we are very, very much, putting out and calling these systems degenerative. And we've got to use that word to very much define what regenerative is. The other one is this, is we use the word, you heard Vandana use it, regenerative organic, based on the practices of agroecology. And we actually see organic as the base, but we need to be better than organic. There's a lot of issues. Actually need to be better than agroecology. We need to regenerate all of farming. On top of that, we actually need to regenerate our biodiversity, our democracy. We need to generate our communities. In other words, we start talking about the bigger picture of regeneration. It's not just farming and soils. It's people and planet.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thank you. Helen, I know you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Just very quickly, just to link how important that link is between production methods and what we're actually growing. So I think it's fine to have these conversations about production methods, of course, but if we are looking at organic systems, for example, to do that globally is only really feasible if we quite drastically change what we're actually producing and consuming. So, for example, at the global level, that would be shift towards plant-based diets. I think it's important to bring that context of what we produce into how we produce it as well, and not kind of separate those two things out.
Great. Thank you. It's a great question. Thank you. I'm going to take a couple more from the audience, and then I do want to do a couple online. I think this gentleman here has had his hand up for a while. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Sorry?
Yeah. Yes. Should be to a woman.
Yeah. Maybe the lady at the back.
Poor guy.
Which lady?
We'll come back to you. We'll if we do the lady at the back first, and then come back.
From Frances Robinson. I'm with the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics. You're wanting change to occur, and politics has been mentioned and economics has been mentioned. Very little discussion of ethics. And part of the reason we're in the problem now, both in terms of biodiversity loss and terrible animal welfare issues, is that ethics were wrong. And the ethics were wrong, and it goes back about 2,500 years. And it was to do with the way they thought animal minds or didn't work. And we know, though, that they do work. So basically, the ethics was wrong. If we get the ethics right, if we look at the scientific detail and work out what is the best we can do at this moment and be prepared to go back and check as more information becomes available. The point being that if we get the ethics right of how to achieve this goal of regeneration, then you can have the legal profession involved. And the legal profession then will create the rules by which we have to act. So then it doesn't become a massive political debate with self-interest. It becomes what's the right thing to do, and then have the legal profession backing that up. So that was really all I wanted to say.
Yeah. Does anyone want to respond to that? Philip?
Frances, thank you so much for your point. Very well made. And of course, ethics is a central theme. And certainly from Compassion in World Farming's point of view, we very much see the interconnectivity of the issues, but that animal welfare as our central ethic as an organisation, that animal welfare should be integral and central as a litmus test to a future fit food system. So folding ethics with practice that is in harmony with nature is, I very much believe, the way to go, and will help us to elicit other tools. You mentioned the legal profession to advance our movement. So an inclusive movement coming together around the big themes made up of different interests, I think will give us the strongest mobilization that we can to face this challenge. Thank you.
Lady in the front.
It's just a very quick point, so as not to take up too much time. Thank you all, and the questions. They're going in a direction that's been concerning me a little bit, is we do have the giant corps, and there is one legal body that is doing quite a considerable amount of work in this sort of how do we get an ethical and legal framework, and that's the ecocide movement, which I'm sure you're all connected with. And at the back of my mind, what's going on all the time is the giant corps are such beasts. And to find a way to, it's sort of when you were talking about the militarization of the land that has occurred thanks to them, how do we have a system of battle that is, of course, not warlike, but somehow, in a way, gets us to push them aside? Do we have to succumb to the idea that we show them that profit can be made our way, and then they come galloping in through, just like poor old Helen of Troy and all of that stuff. Anyway, that's sort of where I was going, and I'd like to just see where you go with that thought.
Bandana.
Yeah. I don't think our work is to show corporations how to make money. That's not our work. Our work is to ensure that we work with the generative forces of a living earth to regenerate those forces. That's why regeneration is important. It reminds us that the earth is living. All her beings are our relatives. They're self-organized, they're intelligent. Our work is to be in service of farmers. Our work is to, most of the money of the world, the public money, is being used to bring junk food to the poor people. Now, easily that could be healthy food from regenerative organic farms. That's what countries like Denmark have done. That's what countries like parts of Brazil have done. Because some people will have purchasing power, but most people have lost it already even before the cost of living crisis. So that's where the public procurement comes in. And there are massive initiatives on this. And as far as the practice of regenerative, the science of regenerative, I want to let you all know that all of September, Andre and I have done a book collecting our 30 years of work in this field, and we offer a course on return to earth, regenerative organic farming. So for anyone who wants to go deeper beyond the silos, and I would definitely say Europe is not the center of the world anymore, and England collapsed a while ago.
Helen, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, litigation's been kind of alluded to a couple of times, so just a quick point on that. I think it's potentially something that we're going to see more of going forward, and that could be quite an important lever in some respects at least. So if we think about the Netherlands as an example, the changes that the government have made in terms of livestock, or planning to make in terms of livestock reduction, were in response to litigation for them not meeting nitrogen targets, basically. So I just wanted to mention that as something that we will probably see more of going forward.
Susan.
Yeah, and on the aspect of obviously looking at, I mean, one thing is farmers are also, and I'll speak, as a child of a smallholder farmer who was educated through farming. And I think if farming didn't pay for my mother, I wouldn't be sitting here where I am today talking with you people. We grew French beans. We used to call them French beans, only for me to come to do my master's in England and realize they are called Kenyan beans because we were growing them. So, so in terms of the current structures of markets, we have to realize that there's something terribly wrong. The public and economic incentives are in favor of industrial models. We have huge subsidies that subsidize the industrial models. And on the other hand, regenerative agroecological practices are hugely knowledge intensive. In fact, I should pick a copy of Vandana's book and increase my knowledge on agroecological practices. I've been very blessed to work, for instance, with the ZBNF movement in Andhra Pradesh and trying to understand the methods of inoculation that are used and the knowledge systems that go into that. What I'm saying is we do not currently create policy or economic incentives for farmers to shift and to scale up what we know very well is what we want. So the market is not sending the signal, the policies are not sending the signals, and yet we expect the farmers to bear the burden of producing good food for us. I mean, it doesn't work that way, and that's why we were saying, especially on the policy side, and shifting those incentives so that farmers who are growing food in a regenerative way are also the ones who are reaping benefits from that system. That needs to happen.
Great, thank you. Brilliant. I just want to take one final question. I do want to take a question from online. We've had quite a lot of questions, so we're not going to get to them all. We've had quite a few questions around a just agricultural transition and how we support farmers, farm workers and others transition sometimes from a very industrial factory farm system towards more regenerative agroecological approaches, and questions around, how do we do that? Is there a role for government to do that? Do you want to take that question? It's a big question.
Thank you. No, I think it's indeed a very important question. The first answer is that the prices that today the end consumers pay absolutely do not reflect the social, environmental, health costs of industrial farming processes. The big players have not been imposed the internalization of negative externalities. They are not forced to reflect in the prices that they charge the costs to the environment and to the people and to future generations. And what consumers do not pay, taxpayers pay either in the form of subsidies, including for the use of fossil fuels, or future generations will have to bear the costs of in the form of natural capital being depleted. So the first answer is, let's get the prices right. It's simply unacceptable that today it is more expensive to buy, consume organic foods that maintain soil health, biodiversity, and allow to protect the health of populations than it is to buy processed foods that are the result of industrial farming systems. So that is the first thing. And farmers will gain from the agroecological practices if the prices are right. Secondly, it does take time to set up a well-functioning agroecological system with, intercropping and finding the right interrelationships between plants, animals, and trees in a knowledge-intensive type of production that is much less input-intensive, but that can be delicate to set up. And so during a period of time, 3-4 years perhaps, yes, food producers should be supported in making that change. And I think it is not sufficient just to impose on them to make changes in a top-down manner. They should be provided the right incentives, and they should be involved in identifying the right ways of doing things, mostly by farmer field schools or others, peer-to-peer exchange mechanisms, so that the knowledge is shared in a very taking into account the local context. And the third and final point is that agroecology is not just about how you produce. It's also about how markets are organized, how the links are made between the farmers and the eaters, who are the middlemen, the intermediaries, the processing, the companies, the retailers that intervene between the two. And agroecology will not thrive unless markets are also reformed to allow much easier access of consumers to agroecological produce. That means short food chains, territorial markets, in order to create new marketing opportunities for the farmers. So we should stop speaking about agroecology simply as a set of agronomic techniques. We should see it as a much broader agenda of reforming markets and also creating a social movement in support of those reforms.
Yeah. Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah. Quick,
And
very quick. Very
finally,
quick. Yeah.
Vandana.
Yeah. I think if there's one thing this conference has come to an emerging new consensus about, is that we are living in a world of relatives, other sentient beings, and we are not the only ones around, and we are not the only intelligent ones around, and the world is not for us only. It's for all beings. Given that, I think the issue of injustice and justice has to be beyond the anthropocentric definitions. And I have watched how every time you're fairer to the soil and you're more just to the biodiversity, you're also fairer to the farmer, the farm worker, etc. Therefore, we have to, in that enlarging circle of compassion, bring justice. And at least my experience has shown, working with, we've trained 2 million farmers in regenerative organic over these many years. The farmers who grow more biodiversity, I gave the data in the morning, but the farmers who grow biodiversity and become free of chemicals, that's what regenerative is about, are actually earning 10 times more. And that's in a book called Wealth Per Acre. And most importantly, the farmers reclaim multiple sovereignties. Their sovereignty over their seed, the sovereignty over their food and food systems, their sovereignty over their knowledge, which is key, especially to get over the epistemic apartheid that farmers don't know and experts know. And finally, market sovereignty. We've created new markets. The idea that a market is created by the global powers is what we have to shed. We've created local markets. We've the distancing between those who grow the food and those who eat the food is where that 95% gets eaten up. And shortening this distance is good for both and for the earth. Short chain is what Oliver talked about. I would say intimacy.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So it just remains for me to close this session and really thank you for your questions. We could have continued well into the evening, I think. We've had loads online, and I'm sure many of you have had your own questions. It's really, really important topic. They're really systemic issues, but maybe you could put your hands together and thank the panel once again for their contribution. Thank you.